Yeah, take it away,
Yeah,
Padich.
thank you. Like yourself, I too carry the marks of infant vaccination.
Yeah,
And you know, any Bharatiya, anybody who travels to and from Bharat, we will have had a whole range of vaccinations. You know, every time you go to Bharat, you have a hepatitis B, you have a polio, and other vaccinations. So we are a vaccinated community. So there's nothing contrary to the principles of vaccination. In fact, it is entirely dharmic. But I needed to dig a little bit deeper at what was developing across the world and phenomena that we're seeing, which struck me as being adharmic. And so I started to do my research, and I must give a shout out to Mitra Desai. She is a lady who has done a huge amount of research on this particular issue, and her work with regard to the historical records is wonderful. Everybody should have a look at it, and she enabled me to move forward with my understanding at a very fast pace. And so her work is Shitala, it's available, and do have a look at it. It will provide additional evidence. So, what would a Hindu perspective, a dharmic perspective on this sort of process actually be? Now, one thing that began to trouble me was this notion of mandatory vaccinations and of vaccine passports. Um, Very deeply, I felt that these were an act of violence. And so I started to put into words why this was the case. You know, Hinsa and Ahimsa, they're core values in our Sanatan tradition. The reason we have a civilization which spans at least 13,000 years of continuous exploration, of uninterrupted civilization at its heart and at its root, the reason we have that is because we understood Hinsa and Ahimsa. And, you know, we have a clear understanding of violence on the intellectual, emotional, and physical space, and that also that violence can occur individually and collectively, and you know, to deceive, to mislead, or to manipulate information which is being presented to a person about their well-being, that's hinsa against the intellectual and physical dimension. And so I also put into my notes the analysis, the understanding that to leverage guilt or fear, to leverage contempt and peer group pressure against a person is also an act of hinsa. It's a manipulation of the emotional dimension of a person. And then the final one we have, which I started to see in Australia, we saw the beginnings of it in France with Macron making some ridiculous statements. We've seen other Euro-Christian leaders making equally violent statements, and that's to use physical force against a person. And that would be to inoculate them, to inject them, but also to restrict them and to make it disadvantageous for them to have freedom of movement and freedom of work. And so that is also an act of hinsa. Those are crystal clear dharmic principles which we should all reflect upon when we're considering mandatory vaccination and vaccine passports. So I'd submit them to our community to ponder upon this and also to get back in touch. I'm more than happy to revisit any of the opinions and the analysis that I've published in this document. And it's an ongoing thing, so we would love to have a contribution. Sridhar, you mentioned Namrata. Namrata is absolutely so important in this. You know, it's Namrata which prevents us from running amok. You know, the human capacity for hubris and pride, you know, for deluding ourselves, false piety, all of those things, they're a very base level of human being. And so one of our foundations in Sanatana Dharma is Namrata, humility. And that prevents us from thinking we know it all. You know, Dharma is such an incredible vision, the complexity of the whole of the earth, the understanding that the earth is a good place to be. The earth is very carefully nurtured an environment in which a human being not only exists, but thrives. You know, everything that we need is in this earth space. And so it's a very positive environment. And if we have the humility, we can see it and recognize it and not damage it. So that namrata is very important. And I'm seeing a complete absence of namrata at the moment in terms of our political governance, but also in terms of our political leaders. And my worry is that the political establishment and those who would take advantage of a period of chaos in human affairs, they really do need to be identified and restrained. Otherwise, we really suffer. And so The other aspect of violence and hinsa is this notion of inviolable human rights. The purpose of a human right to be written is it's a statement saying that under no circumstances is this principle to be discarded. And I recall in the horrific period in Germany when Jewish people were put into concentration camps, there were experts, there were nurses and doctors who were administering injections which they knew would harm the individuals. Injections, many of them, which they knew would kill individuals. And they were experts, they were professionals. And it's as a consequence of that time and recognizing that the masses occasionally act in the most stupid of manners, that these principles that we call inviolable human rights were established. And I have to say that all of these inviolable human rights, they are entirely in consistency with our dharmic principles. In fact, our dharmic principles are significantly larger. And so I was worried that the absence of namrata could well lead to a situation which sort of gathers momentum, it accumulates, it gathers its own energy, fears come into play, and suddenly decisions are being made on completely adharmic principles. And that is a bit of a worry. I mentioned the Titanic violence because that's what happened in the Titanic. So many human beings suddenly thought that they could control everything, and they were given a very dramatic lesson by the earth in humility and also the limits of our ability. And so this is something that is really important that we all consider and give some thoughts to. Now, those are the key aspects of this. In the document, I have scriptural references to one last aspect, which I think is fundamental. And I've referenced the Bhagavad Gita, I've referenced some of the Upanishads. The Katha Upanishad is an extraordinary statement. And this last principle is the principle of karma and of free will. In the Bhagavad Gita, when Arjun has understood everything, he says to Sri Krishna, okay, I've understood everything. Now what do you want me to do? So even on the battlefield, when it's clearly established that the villains are on the other side of the battle and that the choice in front of him should really be obvious, the answer from divinity, from Sri Krishnaji, is you have to make your choices and act in accordance with them. Now, this is a fundamental religious edict. And this is one of those unbelievably powerful foundations which has helped us preserve Sanatani civilization across the millennia. We are called infidels and kufr and things like this, which are derogatory hate speech, and we have been called those things for such a long period of time because of this particular principle. We are not required to believe and act on something which doesn't satisfy our head and which doesn't satisfy our heart. In fact, we are exhorted, we are propelled and given blessings to act in accordance with one's deepest wisdom and in accordance with one's understanding of Dharma. And so we are the one tradition which has always said, no, we refuse blind belief. And there is a part of me that is now beginning to see this rush to force vaccination is almost becoming religious. That fervor is becoming present. I've heard statements recently which say, trust the science, follow the science, when in fact scientific method is established by challenging prevalent scientific understanding. It is a completely open landscape that you have. You shouldn't be restricted. Anything and everything should be available to you for your scrutiny and for your understanding. And so, as I said, there's a religious dimension which is creeping in, which is an act of intellectual violence. And so, from our Sanatani religious principles, we have the right to reject forced vaccination. We have the right to reject mandatory vaccination. It should ultimately be our individual choice. Our informed consent is a fundamental part of Sanatani religious dharmic principles. And within the document that I've produced, there is detailed evidence to support.
Dan gaan we naar Toch ja. Dan gaan we stemming over aangehouden motie ingediend bij het debat over de ontwikkelingen rondom het coronavirus. En voordat we van start gaan met de stemmingen, geef ik eerst het woord aan mevrouw Van den Berg van het CDA.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Voorzitter, heel Nederland snakt naar een einde van de pandemie. Niemand wil nu 2G, ook het CDA niet. Gelukkig worden we met de huidige Omicron-variant minder mensen ernstig ziek, komen minder mensen in het ziekenhuis en op de IC. In de huidige situatie heeft 2G geen meerwaarde en is daarmee niet proportioneel. Dus nu geen 2G, ook het kabinet ziet dit in en zet 2G terecht in de ijskast. Maar een motie die uitspreekt iets niet in te voeren wat niemand wil is overbodig. En een motie die vraagt om een wetsvoorstel in te trekken vinden we bovendien staatsrechtelijk niet zuiver. Daarom stemt de CDA-fractie tegen. Voorzitter, nu het de goede kant op gaat, moeten wij vooruitkijken naar een nieuwe strategie voor de lange termijn. Ja. Zorg voor elkaar, vraag niet om moties voor de bühne, maar een gewetensvolle afweging van belangen. Dank u wel.
Dank u wel, mevrouw Van den Berg. Dan gaan we stemmen over motie 25-295, nummer 1760. Dat is de motie van der Staaij-Omtzigt over intrekken van het wetsvoorstel voor het corona-toegangsbewijs. Wie is voor deze motie? SP, GroenLinks, Bijeen, Volt, Denk, Partij van de Arbeid, Partij voor de Dieren, ChristenUnie, SGP, Omtzigt, Ja21, BB, PVV, Vorm van Democratie, Groep van Haga. Aangenomen. Meneer Van der Staaij, SGP.
Voorzitter, verheugend dat de Kamermeerderheid deze motie steunt en een heldere grens trekt. Maar omdat die ontraden was, wil ik mede namens collega Omtzigt vragen om snel een brief van het kabinet te krijgen over de uitvoering van de motie.
Dank u wel. Meneer Van der Staaij, we zullen dit doorgeleiden aan het kabinet. Dan schors ik de vergadering voor een enkel moment en dan